He was suspicious of her neighbor's strange behavior until she decided to follow him, and what she discovered was Susan woke up every day with the first ray of sunshine, when the light slipped through the gaps in the curtain and heralded the start of another day. Her movements were almost automatic, a silent dance through the house that she performed perfectly. Breakfast was simple, but meticulously prepared. Fresh bread, hot coffee, and a slice of white cheese. She lived alone in a modest but cozy apartment. The walls were adorned with photographs from old travels, reminders of more carefree times. Susan worked as a literature teacher at a local school, where her passion for books and stories inspired the students to dream of worlds beyond their own. Every morning after breakfast, Susan would descend the stairs of the building, greeting the neighbors she met along the way. It was only a few words, but they were filled with sincerity and kindness. Susan enjoyed walking to school, feeling the morning breeze and watching the city slowly wake up. The narrow tree-lined streets, the shops opening their doors, the aroma of fresh bread escaping from the bakeries, all were part of her daily ritual. At work, Susan dedicated herself diligently. Her classes were lively, filled with heated discussions about characters and plots. She had a special gift for capturing the students' attention, leading them to question and reflect. However, despite the vibrant atmosphere of the classroom, there was an emptiness in her gaze that few noticed. After school, Susan would return home, following the same tranquil route. In the evening, her company was a carefully chosen book, a hot tea, and the soft music that filled the apartment's silence. Thus, Susan's days passed, marked by a nearly monotonous tranquility, which she appreciated in its simplicity. But Susan was not an ordinary person, and her peaceful routine was about to be unexpectedly disrupted. Something began to disturb the order of her days, a restlessness that manifested in small details. And it all started when she noticed the strange behavior of the upstairs neighbor. It all began on a morning like any other, when Susan crossed paths with David at the building entrance. David was a discreet man, almost invisible to the other residents. He worked as a freelance journalist and spent most of his time locked in his apartment. They exchanged formal greetings, but Susan knew little about him. That morning, however, something made her stop and observe more closely. David seemed different. His eyes, usually cold and distant, were restless, almost paranoid. He was carrying a large backpack, which was not uncommon, but the way he clutched it to his body, as if guarding a secret, caught Susan's attention. In the following days, she began to notice other peculiarities. David left and returned at odd hours, often during the night. Susan heard his footsteps in the corridor, the creaking of doors, and wondered what he was doing. He also started avoiding eye contact and seemed more nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder as if he were being followed. One night, Susan heard voices coming from David's apartment. They were muffled murmurs, almost imperceptible, but there was something disturbing about them. She approached the wall, trying to understand what was being said, but the words were indistinct, like a whisper of conspiracy. When the sounds abruptly stopped, Susan stepped back, her heart racing. Intrigued and a bit frightened, Susan began to pay more attention. She noticed that he received unexpected visitors, people she had never seen in the building before. The visits were quick, always at night, and David seemed nervous, as if involved in something clandestine. One afternoon, as Susan was heading to work, she encountered David in the lobby. He was pale, sweating profusely. When he saw her, he tried to smile, but it was just a grimace. Susan asked if everything was all right, and he only nodded affirmatively before rushing out without looking back. Susan's curiosity grew with each passing day. David's behavior didn't make sense, and the pieces of the puzzle didn't fit. She began to wonder if he was in some sort of trouble or hiding something darker. There was something about the situation that deeply unsettled her, and Susan knew she had to find out what was going on. The tranquility of her routine was turning into a mystery she couldn't ignore. Susan could no longer ignore the feeling that something was very wrong. The uneasiness followed her during her classes, on her walks through the city, and even in the moments of reading that used to be her refuge. She decided she needed to talk to someone about her suspicions, someone who could offer a different perspective. That's when she arranged to have coffee with Sarah, her longtime friend and confidant. Sarah was the opposite of Susan in many ways. Where Susan was calm and reserved, Sarah was energetic and outgoing. Working as an investigative journalist, she was used to dealing with complicated and unsettling situations. When Susan started to recount David's strange behaviors, Sarah listened attentively, her eyes sparkling with interest. "Do you think he's involved in something illegal?" Sarah asked, stirring her cappuccino. "I don't know," Susan replied, her voice low. "But something is definitely not right. The night visits, the whispers. It's like he's hiding something." Sarah leaned forward, curiosity written all over her face. "Have you thought about confronting him? Asking directly what's going on?" Susan shook her head. "I'm not sure I have the courage. What if he's really in trouble, or worse, if it's dangerous?" Sarah smiled, a smile Susan knew well. It was the smile of someone about to dive into a new investigation. "Then let's find out together," she said. "We can't let this story go without understanding what's happening. We'll start by watching more closely, and if needed, we'll take action." Susan felt a wave of relief hearing Sarah's words. She wasn't alone with her suspicions anymore. She had someone she could trust, someone who could help her unravel the mystery surrounding David. The two friends spent the rest of the afternoon discreetly planning. Sarah suggested they keep a journal of David's activities, noting every suspicious move. Susan agreed, feeling a bit safer with a plan in mind. They decided that Sarah would also start visiting the building under the pretext of seeing Susan, to observe David without raising suspicion. When they parted that afternoon, Susan felt lighter. The worries hadn't disappeared, but now there was a path to follow, a chance to understand what was happening with her neighbor. And with Sarah by her side, she was more confident that whatever secret David was hiding, they would uncover it. The days dragged on slowly, and Susan felt an increasing need to act. The notes in the journal revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior in David. However, as much as she trusted Sarah's investigative skills, there was something Susan needed to do alone. She felt personally involved in this mystery somehow, so one night she made a decision. She would follow David herself. She waited until the clock struck midnight, the time when David usually left the house in recent days. Dressed in dark, comfortable clothes, Susan positioned herself strategically at the building's entrance, hidden in the shadows. When she finally saw David leave the building, once again carrying that bulky backpack, she held her breath and began to follow him at a safe distance. The streets were almost deserted, illuminated only by the yellow streetlights. David walked quickly, occasionally glancing over his shoulder, as if sensing he was being followed. Susan moved carefully, trying not to make any noise. Her heart was pounding, each step echoing in her ears. David entered a more distant and gloomy neighborhood, where the houses were old and poorly maintained. Susan started to feel a shiver of fear. For a moment, she questioned her decision to follow him alone, but curiosity was stronger. She needed to know what he was doing. Suddenly, David stopped in front of an abandoned warehouse. Susan hid behind a tree, watching as he opened the rusty door and disappeared inside. Taking a deep breath, Susan silently approached and peeked through the crack in the door. Inside, she saw David talking to a group of men. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but David's serious expression and the tense atmosphere indicated it wasn't a friendly meeting. Susan tried to understand the scene before her. Was David a victim or an accomplice? What was in that backpack? She felt she was getting close to a crucial revelation, but before she could decide her next move, she heard a noise behind her. She turned quickly, her heart in her throat, and saw a shadow approaching. She crouched down, trying to hide further in the shadows, but the figure came closer until Susan could distinguish the face. It was Sarah, with a determined look. "Did you really think I'd let you do this alone?" Sarah whispered, pulling Susan to a safer spot. Susan felt a mix of relief and frustration. "I didn't want to put you in danger." "We're in this together, remember?" Sarah replied. "Now let's find out what's happening here, but carefully." The two friends repositioned themselves near the door, watching and waiting for the right moment to act. The night was just beginning, and Susan felt that the truth was finally within reach. They just needed to be brave and smart to unravel the mystery surrounding David. The night was dark and silent, the only sound being the rustling of leaves in the wind. Susan and Sarah, hidden in the shadows, watched David's every move carefully. The abandoned warehouse had a sinister air, with its worn walls and broken windows, and the friends knew they had to be cautious. As they observed, David exited the warehouse, now without the backpack. He seemed calmer, but there was still a tension in his stride. Susan and Sarah decided to follow him again, keeping a safe distance to avoid being discovered. David walked several blocks, leading them to a completely different neighborhood. The streets became narrower and darker, and Susan began to feel uncomfortable with the unfamiliar surroundings. Finally, he stopped in front of a small house, almost hidden between two tall buildings. Susan recognized the house immediately. It was a shelter for homeless people that she had visited a few times as a volunteer. Susan exchanged a confused look with Sarah. What was David doing there? He knocked on the door with a sequence of taps that seemed like a code. The door opened, revealing a middle-aged woman with a worried expression. David quickly entered, and the door closed behind him. Sarah and Susan cautiously approached the house, trying to hear what was happening inside. From outside, the sound was muffled, but they could catch a few words and phrases. Money, help, danger. Each word increased Susan's curiosity and concern. Suddenly, the door opened again, and David came out accompanied by the woman. Susan and Sarah quickly hid behind a parked car. David was speaking to the woman calmly, trying to reassure her. They heard something about a plan and needing more time. After David left, Susan and Sarah decided to follow the woman for a while, curious to find out more. She walked only a few blocks to an old building, which Susan knew was a community center offering services to needy families. The woman entered and began distributing food and clothes to the needy, an act of kindness that seemed in contrast with the tension she had shown moments before. Susan and Sarah were perplexed. David, with his strange behavior and suspicious meetings, seemed to be involved in something much more complex and possibly altruistic than they had imagined. He wasn't a common criminal, but someone who was deeply involved in helping the less fortunate. Still, there were many unanswered questions. Who were the men in the warehouse? What was the plan David mentioned? Susan felt they were only scratching the surface of a much larger mystery. And now, with Sarah by her side, she was more determined than ever to uncover the whole truth. After the discovery at the community center, Susan and Sarah realized the situation was more complicated than they had imagined. They needed more information, but they knew any misstep could jeopardize everything. Susan decided that the only way to truly understand what David was doing was to approach him carefully, without raising suspicion. The next morning, Susan woke up early and headed to the local market, where she knew David did his weekly shopping. She pretended to be interested in fruits, peeking discreetly between the shelves while waiting for the right moment. It didn't take long for David to appear, walking with his usual worried expression. Susan slowly approached, pretending it was a coincidence. "David, what a surprise to see you here," she said with a friendly smile. David looked surprised, but quickly forced a smile. "Hi, Susan. I didn't expect to see you here so early either." She tried to keep the conversation casual, asking about his interests and hobbies, trying to learn more about his life without seeming intrusive. David seemed reluctant, responding with few words, but Susan noticed a subtle change in his posture. He was more suspicious, looking around as if expecting to be followed. In the following days, Susan continued to approach David on different occasions. She started bumping into him in the building's corridor, offering help to carry groceries and initiating conversations on various topics. She knew she needed to build a relationship of trust, but she also had to be patient. One of those times, Susan found David leaving the building with the same bulky backpack. "Are you making a delivery?" she asked casually, trying to hide her curiosity. David hesitated for a moment before responding. "Yeah, something like that. I need to take some things to a friend." Susan smiled, but her heart was racing. "If you need any help, I'm here." He thanked her, but declined the offer. However, the seed of trust had been planted. Susan continued to approach him discreetly, observing and gathering information without raising suspicion. One night, Susan decided to take a bolder step. When she heard David leaving his apartment, she followed him again, but this time she tried a different approach. Instead of just following him, Susan decided to confront him. "David, can we talk?" she said, emerging from the shadows. David was surprised, but there was something in his expression that suggested exhaustion, as if he was tired of hiding secrets. "Susan, how can I help you?" She took a deep breath, feeling the tension in the air. "I know you're involved in something bigger than it seems. I saw you at the warehouse. I saw your visits to the shelter and the community center. I'm worried about you, and I want to understand what's going on." David looked around, making sure they were alone. With a frightened look, he began to stammer, his eyes wide with a mix of anger, confusion, and relief. Then, with a sigh, he thought carefully about what she already knew and said, "Maybe it's time for you to know the truth, but we need to be careful. Let's go somewhere safer to talk." Susan felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She was about to discover what David was hiding, but she knew this could change everything. She followed him, hoping the truth would finally come to light. David led Susan through narrow streets and poorly lit alleys until they reached a small cafe, almost hidden between old buildings. The place was practically empty, except for a sleepy barista and a few scattered customers. They sat in an isolated corner where they could talk without being overheard. Susan felt the tension in the air. David was visibly nervous, his eyes constantly scanning the environment. After a few minutes of silence, he finally began to speak. "Susan, what I'm about to tell you isn't easy to hear, but I think I need to share this with someone." She nodded, encouraging him to continue. "A few months ago, my younger brother got involved in something dangerous," David began, his voice low and trembling. "He was forced to work for a local gang, smuggling counterfeit medicines. When he tried to leave, he was threatened. They said if he didn't continue, they would go after our family." Susan's eyes widened in shock. "And you? How did you get involved in this?" "I couldn't leave him alone," David responded, his voice filled with despair. "I started investigating the gang, trying to find a way to get him out. That's when I met people who were in the same situation. Good people trapped in a cycle of fear and violence." David paused, struggling to maintain his composure. "That backpack you saw, it contains evidence I've collected against the gang. Documents, recordings, everything that could help the police take them down. I've been working with the woman from the community center and others to gather this evidence and protect those in need." Susan was confused, unsure if it was true, and if it was really all true, she didn't expect the situation to be so serious. "So, the meetings at the warehouse, they're to plan how we're going to deliver this evidence without putting anyone else at risk," David explained. "We're close, but it's risky. Every move could be the last." She felt a chill run down her spine. "Why didn't you ask for help earlier?" David looked at her, his eyes full of anguish. "I couldn't risk more lives, Susan. I've seen what they're capable of. But now that you know, I understand if you want to step away." Susan shook her head, determined. "I'm not going to abandon you, David. We'll find a way to end this together and protect everyone who's in danger." David smiled for the first time in weeks, a smile of hope. "Thank you, Susan. Your help could make a difference." They spent the night planning the next step, with Susan promising to do everything she could to help. She knew she was getting involved in something dangerous, but she also knew she couldn't turn her back on David and all the people he was trying to save. From that moment on, they were united by a greater cause, and Susan was willing to risk everything for the truth and for justice. After that revealing night at the cafe, Susan returned home with her mind racing. David's words echoed in her head, and the weight of the responsibility she now carried pressed on her like never before. As she tried to sleep, she tossed and turned, unable to find comfort in any position. She thought about her friend, his brother, and the people trapped in a cycle of fear and violence. The next day, Susan dragged herself to school, but her mind was far from the classes and students. David's revelation had planted a seed of doubt and confusion that grew with each passing moment. During the break, sitting in the teacher's lounge with a coffee in her hand, she stared into space, trying to decide what to do. Should she tell someone? She could involve the police, but she knew that could put David and everyone involved in immediate danger. And if the gang found out they were being investigated, their revenge could be swift and brutal. During lunch, Susan met with Sarah, who immediately noticed her unease. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," Sarah said, concerned. Susan sighed deeply, summoning the courage to open her heart. "Sarah, I discovered something serious about David, something that could change everything." Sarah leaned in, her eyes wide. "What did you find out?" Susan hesitated, knowing she was about to share a dangerous secret. "David is involved in something very dangerous. His brother was forced to work for a gang, and David has been collecting evidence against them. He's trying to take them down, but it's too risky. I don't know if I should tell anyone or if that would just make things worse." Sarah was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. "This is serious, Susan. If he has evidence, we need to think of a safe way to use it. Maybe we can find someone in the police who's trustworthy, someone who can help without exposing David and the others." Susan nodded, but she was still tormented by doubt. What if we can't find anyone? What if someone sells out? We've seen it happen before. Sarah placed her hand on Susan's, offering comfort. "We'll think together. We need to be smart and strategic. We can't let fear paralyze us." In the following days, Susan became more introspective, pondering all the possibilities. She spent hours on her balcony, watching the street movements, while her internal struggle continued. She felt responsible for David's safety, but also knew the truth needed to come out. During a particularly silent night, Susan finally made a decision. She needed to trust someone beyond Sarah, someone who had the means to help. With this in mind, she started making a mental list of people she could trust, carefully weighing each name. She knew that any misstep could be fatal. Doubt and confusion were still present, but Susan felt she was moving in the right direction. She knew the path ahead would be dangerous, but she was determined to move forward, no matter the cost. Susan was determined. The days of doubt and confusion had given way to a firm decision. She needed to confront David. The shocking revelations about his situation and the need to act pressured her to take a more direct approach. On a cold night, Susan waited for David in the building corridor, her heart pounding. When she saw him climbing the stairs with his usual worried expression, she knew it was the right moment. He stopped when he saw her, surprise and apprehension mixing on his face. "David, we need to talk," said Susan, her voice firm but gentle. David hesitated, looking around to make sure they were alone. "Susan, now isn't a good time. I have to—" David sighed, the weight of the secret visibly crushing him. He slowly nodded and gestured for Susan to follow him to his apartment. Once inside, he locked the door and indicated for her to sit down. "Susan, I didn't want to involve you in this," he began, his voice low. "But now that you know, there's no going back. Yes, I'm trying to bring down this gang. They threatened my brother and I couldn't stand by. But the situation is more dangerous than you can imagine." "I understand the danger," Susan responded, her eyes fixed on David's. "But hiding this only makes things worse. We need a plan, allies we can trust." David shook his head, visibly frustrated. "And who can we trust? The police? We've seen how corrupt they can be. Every wrong step could cost us our lives." Susan took a deep breath, feeling the tension in the air. "Sarah and I discussed this. We can find someone trustworthy, someone who can help us without jeopardizing everything. But we need to be strategic. We can't do this alone." David looked at her, his expression softening. "You're right, Susan, we can't do this alone, but that means you can't go telling people. You and Sarah will be in as much danger as I am. Are you willing to take that risk?" Susan nodded without hesitation. "We're in this together. We've already decided, and the sooner we act, the sooner we can end this threat." David seemed to ponder for a moment before finally agreeing. "Then we need a plan, and we need to start now." They spent the night planning each move, mapping out contacts and strategies. David revealed important details Susan didn't know, and together they began to form a plan that could bring justice and safety. Susan knew the confrontation was just the beginning. They were about to enter a dangerous game where every move had to be calculated carefully. But now, with David by her side and the determination to protect those she loved, Susan felt stronger and more resolute than ever. As they planned the next steps, Susan realized there were even more layers to David's secret that needed to be uncovered. They were sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and notes, when Susan looked directly into David's eyes and asked, "David, why are you really doing this?" It's not just for your brother. There's something more, isn't there? David sighed deeply, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Yes, Susan. There's more than just saving my brother, he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. I didn't tell you everything because it's difficult, painful. Susan waited patiently, feeling that the truth was about to emerge. A few years ago, I was married, David began, the pain evident in his eyes. My wife, Christine, was everything to me. She was a social activist, always fighting for the rights of the underprivileged. One day she discovered something terrible about this gang. They weren't just smuggling counterfeit medicines, they were also involved in human trafficking and other horrific activities. Susan held her breath, feeling the gravity of the story. Christine started gathering evidence, much like what I'm doing now. She wanted to expose the truth and bring justice, but before she could reveal everything, the gang found out what she was doing. They killed her and made it look like an accident, David said, his voice breaking. Susan felt a lump in her throat, tears welling in her eyes. David, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. He shook his head, trying to compose himself. After Christine died, I promised myself I would continue her work, that I would bring those responsible to justice. But I had to be careful. I had to protect my brother and everyone else who was at risk. Susan took David's hand, offering support. Now I understand why this is so important to you. It's not just about your brother, it's about honoring Christine's memory and continuing her fight. David nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Susan. Your support means more than you know. Together, we can make sure Christine's death wasn't in vain. From that moment on, Susan and David were bound by a common purpose. They knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but they were ready to face it together. With Sarah's help and their unwavering determination, they would uncover the truth and bring justice to those who had suffered for so long. David nodded, wiping away a solitary tear that escaped. Exactly. I can't let her sacrifice be in vain. And now, with your help and Sarah's, I feel like we finally have a real chance to do this. Susan felt a new determination growing inside her. Christine's story and David's commitment gave her renewed clarity about what needed to be done. Let's honor Christine's memory, David, and let's make sure this gang pays for all their crimes. They returned to work with new energy, knowing they were fighting for something much bigger than themselves. Susan felt that each step they took brought them closer to justice and the truth. David's words still echoed in Susan's mind as she returned to her apartment. The night was cold, but she barely felt the biting wind on her face, lost in her own thoughts. The revelation about Christine had changed everything. With each step she took, she felt the weight of responsibility growing, and her emotions flowed like an uncontrollable tide. As soon as she entered her home, Susan was overwhelmed by a wave of conflicting feelings. She sat on the sofa, her gaze lost, and let the tears flow freely. There was a deep pain for the loss of Christine, a woman she had never met, but whose story had deeply touched her. She felt David's anguish, the lonely struggle he had faced for so long, and the courage he showed in continuing his wife's dangerous work. Susan also felt a growing anger against the gang that had destroyed so many lives. The thought of Christine being killed for trying to do good ignited a desire for justice that propelled her forward. But along with the anger, there was fear. Fear of what could happen if they failed, fear of the gang's reprisals, fear that more innocent people might get hurt. Amid this storm of emotions, Susan picked up the phone and called Sarah. She needed to hear her friend's voice to feel that she wasn't alone in this battle. Sarah answered quickly, and Susan couldn't hold back the tears as she recounted everything David had revealed. Susan, this is much more serious than we imagined, Sarah said, the concern evident in her voice. But we're in this together. We'll find a way to deal with this. You're not alone. Sarah's words brought a momentary comfort, but Susan knew the journey ahead would be difficult. She hung up the phone and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. The view used to calm her, but that night, it only increased her feeling of isolation. Susan spent the night awake, thinking and rethinking every detail, every plan. She felt on the brink of an abyss, but she knew she had to take the next step. She rose with the first light of dawn, her eyes tired but her heart determined. She prepared for another day, knowing that despite her heightened emotions she had to move forward. She needed to honor Christine's memory and help David fulfill his promise. Every move she made, every decision taken, would be crucial in bringing justice and protecting those in danger. As she left home, Susan felt a renewed determination. She was ready to face whatever came next. Determined to honor Christine's memory and help David, Susan plunged headfirst into the search for answers. She woke up early and stayed up late, dividing her time between teaching at school and investigating. She felt that every minute counted and that any slip could be fatal. Susan began by sifting through public records and archives, searching for information about the gang. She spent hours at the library, flipping through old newspapers, trying to find any mention of the crimes David had mentioned. Among news of disappearances and police operations, Susan started to piece together a clearer picture of the criminal network's extent. She also began to pay closer attention to the movements around the building. She noted the night visitors and unfamiliar cars that passed by slowly, memorizing license plates and faces. Her apartment became an improvised operations center, with maps, photos, and notes covering the walls. One night, while she was immersed in a pile of documents, Susan received a message from Sarah. "I found something interesting. Meet me at the usual cafe in an hour." Susan hurried to pack her things and went to meet Sarah. At the cafe, Sarah was already waiting with a laptop open in front of her. "I am Sarah to hack into one of the gang members' emails," Sarah said, a triumphant glint in her eyes. "Look at this." Susan leaned over the screen, reading the messages exchanged between the gang members. There were details about transactions, names of accomplices, and even locations of secret meetings. Among the messages, one stood out: a meeting planned for the following week, where gang leaders would discuss their next steps. "We need to tell David," Susan said, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "This could be our chance to catch them all at once." Sarah agreed, but her expression turned serious. "Susan, we need to be careful. If we're caught, we won't have a second chance." Returning home, Susan met with David to discuss what they had discovered. He listened attentively, his face becoming a mask of concentration. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, his eyes shining with a mix of hope and caution. "But we need to plan this meticulously. We can't make mistakes." In the following days, Susan, David, and Sarah worked tirelessly to craft the perfect plan. Susan used her research skills to identify the gang's weaknesses, while Sarah ensured their communications remained secure and away from prying eyes. One of the most critical points of the plan was finding a way to ensure the authorities involved were trustworthy. Susan and Sarah began investigating the backgrounds of local police officers, looking for those with a history of integrity and justice. Finally, they found a detective known for his unwavering ethics and willingness to fight corruption. Susan decided he was the right person to trust with the evidence they had collected. With the day of the gang's meeting approaching, Susan felt a mix of nervousness and determination. She knew she was entering dangerous territory, but also knew she couldn't back down now. The search for answers had led her to this point, and she was ready to face whatever came next. On the night before the meeting, Susan barely slept. She reviewed the plan over and over in her mind, ensuring every detail was covered. When morning came, she met with David and Sarah one last time before putting the plan into action. "We're ready," David said, placing a hand on Susan's shoulder. "Let's do this for Christine and for everyone counting on us." Susan nodded, feeling courage flow through her veins. It was time to confront the truth and ensure justice prevailed. On the day of the gang's meeting, they had arranged to meet at a strategic point where they could observe the warehouse without being seen. The trustworthy detective that Susan and Sarah had identified was also aware of the plan and had told them to stay put and not act on their own. As they waited, the silence was broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the occasional whisper of the wind. Susan was tense, her eyes fixed on the warehouse entrance. She felt they were close to something big, but uncertainty still hung in the air. Suddenly, David's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and his expression changed drastically. "What's wrong?" Susan asked, feeling a chill. "I just received an anonymous message," David said, showing the screen to Susan and Sarah. The message read, "There's a traitor among you. Be careful who you trust." Susan felt a knot in her stomach. What does that mean? Who could be betraying us? Before they could discuss further, they saw movement at the warehouse. Several men began to arrive, including some of the gang leaders identified in the emails Sarah had hacked. The detective was close to arriving, but the doubt about the traitor loomed like a shadow. Suddenly, Susan remembered something she had read in the gang's emails, a mention of an informant with powers. With a sinking feeling, she realized they needed to find out who this person was before proceeding. "Sarah, we need to hack deeper into the emails. We need to know who this informant is," Susan said urgently. Sarah quickly connected her laptop and began typing frantically. "Give me a minute," she said, her eyes scanning the screen. After a few tense moments, she found what they were looking for. Here it is, a mention of the informant and a headline from a newspaper. The informant is, my God, it's the detective we trusted. The revelation hit like a bomb. Susan felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The detective they believed to be their greatest hope was actually working for the gang. "We need to warn David and get out of here now," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Susan turned to David, but before she could speak, they heard the sound of cars parking. "It's too late," David said, his expression grim. With the detective approaching with other officers and some gang members, Susan, David and Sarah quickly slipped out the back window of the warehouse, avoiding being seen. "Let's go back to my apartment. We need to reassess our plan and decide what to do next," Susan said, trying to stay calm. When they arrived at the apartment, Susan still felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins. So the detective was playing us the whole time. "But why?" she asked, trying to piece together the puzzle. "Probably trying to find out who was gathering evidence against the gang," David said, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "And now he knows it's us. He didn't see our faces, but he knows our names." Sarah closed her laptop with a snap. "We need to find another way to expose the gang, something that doesn't rely on the police. If the detective is corrupt, who else could be involved?" Susan nodded, feeling determination harden inside her. "We have to act quickly and smartly. We need more evidence and a plan that can't be compromised." With this new twist, Susan, David and Sarah knew they were venturing into even more dangerous territory. But now, more than ever, they were determined to bring the truth to light and ensure justice was served. Back at the apartment, Susan, David and Sarah were on high alert. They knew time was against them, and that they needed to act quickly to resolve the situation before the traitorous detective could dismantle their entire plan. Sitting around the kitchen table, they charted a new course of action with renewed determination. "We need to gather more evidence and ensure it's delivered to someone beyond the gang's reach," Susan said, her eyes shining with resolve. "We have to find someone trustworthy, someone who can bring this information to justice without being compromised." David agreed, his face serious. "I know an investigative journalist who worked with Christine in the past. He has an impeccable reputation and the resources to expose the truth, but he has been threatened and promised never to go near the gang again. If we can get the evidence to him and convince him to help us, we can ensure the story is published." Sarah nodded, already typing on her laptop to contact the journalist. "I'll prepare everything. We need to be quick and careful." In the following hours, Susan and David worked together, reviewing all the evidence they had collected. They organized documents, recordings, and images, ensuring nothing was missing. Every detail mattered, and they knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. While Sarah finalized the arrangements, Susan and David discussed the delivery plan. "We'll meet in a public place, where it's harder for the gang or the detective to attack us," Susan suggested. David agreed. "And we need to ensure there's a backup copy of the evidence in a safe place. If anything happens, we'll still have a chance to expose the truth." With the plan in mind, they arranged to meet the journalist the following afternoon in a busy city park. Susan felt a mix of nervousness and hope, knowing this could be the decisive moment. On the day of the meeting, Susan, David and Sarah headed to the park separately to avoid suspicion. The park was full of families, joggers and people walking their dogs, creating an ideal setting for a safe exchange. The journalist, a middle-aged man with a determined expression, was sitting on a bench, waiting. Susan approached first, sitting next to the journalist. "Thank you for coming," she said, handing over a folder full of documents. "Here is all the evidence we've gathered. It's vital this gets to the public." The journalist nodded, taking the folder carefully. "You're in deep trouble, but for everything I've suffered in the past, you have my word. This will be published, and the truth will be exposed." David and Sarah kept vigilant, watching the surroundings for any sign of danger. Suddenly, Susan noticed a group of suspicious men approaching. She recognized one of them as a gang member. Her heart raced. "We need to go now," Susan whispered to the journalist, standing up quickly. "They're coming." The journalist nodded, pocketing the folder and moving quickly away from the park. Susan, David, and Sarah followed suit, blending into the crowd and heading to their respective homes, making sure they weren't being followed. Back at the apartment, they regrouped, the tension palpable. "We did it," David said, his voice filled with relief. "Now, we wait for the story to break." Susan nodded, feeling a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "We've done everything we can. Now we just have to trust that the truth will come out." As they settled in to wait, the reality of their situation set in. They were still in danger, but they had taken a significant step toward justice. Susan knew the road ahead would be challenging, but with David and Sarah by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. With a swift and coordinated action, Susan, David, and Sarah guided the journalist out of the park, evading the gang members. They mass-arranged to get into a taxi that Sarah had called in advance, leaving the park behind. During the ride, the journalist looked at Susan. "You took a great risk, but I promise it will be worth it. These people will pay for their crimes." Susan felt a wave of relief mixed with continued tension. She knew the hardest part was still ahead, but they had taken a crucial step. "We just want justice," she said, looking gratefully at David and Sarah. In the following days, the journalist did his part, and the story began to unfold in newspapers and on television screens. The gang was exposed, their operations dismantled, and the traitorous detective was arrested. Susan, David, and Sarah watched the news together, feeling a mix of satisfaction and relief. The fight had been tough, but justice had finally prevailed. As they looked to the future, they knew that despite the challenges, they had made a difference. Christine's memory was honored, and Susan and David's courage had changed many lives for the better. The days following the gang's exposure were intense and full of emotions. Susan, David, and Sarah could finally breathe more easily, knowing they had achieved their goal. With the gang dismantled and justice being served, Susan found a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. Sitting on her balcony with a hot cup of tea in her hands, Susan looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. The colors of the twilight painted the sky orange and pink, creating a peaceful landscape that contrasted with the turmoil of the past weeks. She thought about Christine, a woman she had never met but felt she knew intimately. Christine's courage and determination had been a silent inspiration, guiding Susan through this dangerous journey. She felt honored to have been able to continue Christine's work and bring her mission to a just conclusion. Susan also reflected on David, whose personal struggle had deeply touched her. He was not just a neighbor with strange behavior. He was a man marked by tragedy and driven by love and justice. Working alongside David had taught her about resilience and the importance of fighting for what you believe in, even when everything seems against you. She thought about Sarah, her loyal friend, whose intelligence and bravery were crucial to their success. Sarah had shown her the value of true friendship, the importance of having someone to trust, and the power of teamwork to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. But perhaps Susan's greatest reflection was about herself. She had started this journey as a quiet teacher with a peaceful life. Now she felt stronger and more determined. She had learned the importance of stepping out of her comfort zone, facing fears, and acting for the greater good. Susan had discovered a courage within herself that she didn't know she possessed, and it had transformed her. Susan didn't know if life would ever return to normal, but she also knew she would never be the same person. The experiences she had lived through had shaped her in deep and lasting ways. She felt more connected to the world around her, more aware of the injustices that needed to be fought. and more determined to make a difference where she could. She stood up, inspired by the setting sun turning into night. She felt that every end brought a new beginning, and she was ready for what came next. She cherished the lessons learned as precious treasures, knowing that true strength came from the heart and the will to fight for what is right. Susan knew that regardless of future challenges, she was prepared to face them. With the support of friends like David and Sarah, and with Christine's memory to guide her, she was confident she could continue making a difference in the world. And as the stars began to shine in the night sky, Susan felt a deep peace knowing that together they had turned darkness into light. The sun was setting again, casting long shadows across the city, when Susan decided to take one last walk through the park where everything had begun. The air was fresh, and there was a palpable tranquility in the environment, as if the world was sighing with relief after weeks of tension. Susan walked slowly, absorbing the peace around her, when she saw David sitting on a bench, looking thoughtfully at the lake. She approached and sat beside him without saying a word. For a few moments they remained silent, simply appreciating each other's company. Finally, David broke the silence. "You know, Susan, I never imagined we would get this far. There were times when I thought everything was lost." Susan smiled softly. "Me too. But together, we did it. And not just for us, but for Christine, and for all the people we helped." David nodded, emotion evident in his eyes. "Christine would be proud. I know we did what she would have done, and now we can finally move on without the weight of that secret." Susan felt a wave of relief and gratitude. Yes, we can, and we can continue helping people, but in a way that doesn't put our lives at risk at every step. David laughed, a light and free sound that Susan hadn't heard before. "I think we've had our share of adventures for a while. Maybe it's time to find a bit of normalcy again." As the sun disappeared on the horizon, they continued talking, sharing dreams and hopes for the future. Susan felt a deep connection with David, a mutual understanding that went beyond words. They had been through so much together, and it had bonded them in a special way. The next day, Susan went to school. She felt renewed, ready to dedicate herself again to teaching, but with an inner calm, knowing that she had made a difference outside the classroom as well. David, for his part, began working on articles documenting the fight against the gang and the injustices that had been exposed. He knew he had a new mission, to use his skills as a journalist to continue fighting for truth and justice, but now with a wiser and more cautious perspective. Susan and David kept in constant contact, supporting each other as they rebuilt their lives. They met regularly, not only to reminisce about the challenges they had overcome, but to celebrate the small victories of daily life. Each meeting was a reminder that even in the darkest situations, courage could light the way. One afternoon, months later, Susan and David met at the same park bench where they had discussed so many strategies. The lake reflected the blue sky, and the laughter of children playing around created a joyful melody. Sitting side by side in peace, Susan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. "We did it, Susan," David said, holding her hand. "We found the peace we were looking for." Susan smiled, squeezing his hand. "Yes, we did, and I know that, no matter what the future brings, we'll be ready." A mutual understanding and a sense of completion filled the moment. Looking to the future, Susan and David knew that together they could face anything. They had found not only peace, but a friendship and strength that would last forever.